there's a profession here which is not the profession of translation, it's the profession of teaching translation. And unfortunately, I think a lot of that profession is caught up in the greater context of academic bureaucracy, which says in order to be respectable academically, you have to justify yourself in terms that are intelligible to the academic community, right? So here we all are, we're all, more or less self-taught, hopeless, improvising translators, doing our best, living from day to day. And then suddenly we have to become teachers, so we provide this great framework and we create careers out of it. And I hate that. I mean, I am absolutely devoted to the mission of destroying that, because I think it's bad for everybody. I think what it's doing is, if I look back on it over the past 20 years, when I was a boy, a bit like Brian, I mean, translation was just what we did every day. An unseen translation was what we did every week. It was an abstract exercise in logic and in reading, and I thought it was, at the time, I just did it because I was told to do it. And then we translated out of Greek or Latin or into Greek or Latin, and it was just something everybody did. Nobody thought about it. And then sometime around about the 60s, there was a huge reaction against that, and translation was a bad word, and in all job applications, you could not include your translations because they were not publications. They were simply translations, and they were not important, right? Oh, you just translated it, It doesn't count, right? And that was a very important period. Now, things have changed enormously now. Translation is one of the hugest growth areas in academic life. That means there are jobs. That means there's, good salaries to be earned. That means that universities have to somehow justify this as an academic discipline. So the next subject is really, what can we do with translation history? What's the role of history and looking at case studies in the history of translation? And how can we learn from those? How can translators, translation practitioners benefit from studying, for example, the history of Chinese Buddhist translations, or the late 19th century translations of Lin Shu and Yan Fu, or a more recent case, the notebooks of an eminent translator like Ouhk's? And why is it that this area has been so neglected? There is such a lack of available material. Maybe there's gradually more about the Buddhist translations and Lin Shu and Yan Fu, but apart from those, there's so little material that one can give students. And should there be more? Is it useful? How does it fit into the scheme of things? Now, rather than ask everybody, I'm just going to restrict myself to Martha. You knew I was coming to you, and to Juju, because this is something I know both of them are interested in. And I think I'd like to let them just talk about this. Martha.
Well, I think translation history is sort of neglected because it seems to be even more divorced from translation. I mean, it's perceived like that. I remember when I was at the Chinese University of Hong Kong, I was responsible for teaching translation history. Oh God! And it was really a nightmare, because maybe it was me. I didn't teach it well enough. I didn't make it interesting enough. But students kept asking, what's the use of it? What's that got to do with my actual practice of translation? Like Yan Fu, he did it so many years ago, and then people no longer like this, and so on and so forth. So I don't know. Anyway, but my interest is in translation because, as I said, I tend to take translation in a very broad sense of the word, and I never see theory and practice as being divorced from one another. And like, for example, what I'm working on, and perhaps Drew would also like to comment on that, which is an anthology of what I call Chinese discourse on translation. That is what translators in the past have written about translation. So it basically, the first volume covers the Buddhist Sutra translation. And so what's the use of that? Wow, enormously useful. Because, I mean, like this whole idea of translating as a team, or translation assembly, 议场. In the past, you have the chief translator. Very often, that chief translator didn't know the original language. So he was chief translator by virtue of the fact that he had a very good memory, and he could carry the entire sutra in his head, and he would sort of just recite it, and then it would be copied down, and then it would be translated into Chinese, and so on and so forth. And so there's a huge team of people working together. And then people tend to take, sort of evolutionary view of translation history and say, well, the situation is no longer like this because we are now all bilingual, or at least, you have to be at least bilingual before you could practice translation. But then for most of the translation projects that I myself have been involved in, team translation seems to be still very much the practice. And for me, I learned a lot from translation history, and I think it definitely has a place. But I would also say that I have to think very, very carefully of how to relate it to the actual practice of translation.
Thanks.
I would put history under the broader umbrella of a theory. Actually,
You would.
I would. Yeah, yes. Because it is not doing.
That's because you're a Chinese intellectual, right?
No. When you're doing translating, the other side you're reading or talking about translation. So you're reading history of translation, then you are not doing translation. So would reading history of translation be helpful to doing translation? And my answer is yes, but a bit too slow. It takes of course teaching students by doing in class, like in the seminar tutorial, you're doing a little piece of work. Students can learn much faster, and then you're going through the whole 2,000 years of history, and that will take. But I still think the history class is very, very important, and it doesn't help students how to translate, but it can help students to understand what translation is. I think that what translation is a general task of modern translation studies. What is translation? Actually, nobody knows what translation is. If you study theories by different theories, everybody has a different definition, and traditionally they describe or define translation as the relationship, as the equivalence of the kind of things. And well, we know very well the translations are not equivalent to the original. So what is this relationship? So I think by going through history, and so that's the task of modern translation studies is try to describe what translation is, rather than to prescribe what translation should be. So I think history can, in this sense, can help students to understand what translation is. So if you know what translation is, you know what you should do. And I think Martha just said, and it's very useful to talk about, to describe the strategies or the procedures used by previous translators. I think that can save a lot of time in many ways, to show the students you don't have to go through all long list of choices. So in this case, traditionally, the people have done this, and people have failed in that respect. So I think we can learn from history. I think that is my feeling about translation history, and also John's question is, why there's such a lack of such case studies? I think that this is. This is, I think, I don't know whether you call it a disease of modern academics. Scholars, like my graduate, my research students, they do a lot of case studies, but they don't do it just for the hell of it. But they have another theoretical aim, in doing case studies.